We must now go to committee stage and remaining stages of the Residential Tenancies Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2026. And to begin, we'll take section number 1, Amendment 1, ruled out of order. Amendment number 2, Deputy Richard Boyd Barrett and Deputy Murphy. It will be discussed with amendments 2, 7 and 8, which are related. They'll all be discussed together. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
So, this bill, probably the best place to be in responding to this bill by the government is outside with the protesters that are assembling now against this bill, which is a bill that is going to make an already dire housing crisis even worse by allowing landlords already charging extortionate rents that are unaffordable for huge numbers of people to actually reset those rents to even higher levels. Frankly, it beggars belief that the government are doing this, unless you know that really this government isn't representing the interests of the people who are affected by the housing crisis, but is representing the interests of those who are profiteering on the backs of the housing misery of others. There can be no other explanation for what this bill is doing. And what this amendment, the first amendment I put in, was seeking to essentially stop this bill until the government were forced to look at what this would do to the affordability of rents, to force them to stop this bill until they address the issue of no-fault evictions, and to stop this bill until we actually have a plan on the part of the government to make rents affordable. That was ruled out of order, so in the absence of that, this amendment seeks to force the government to do those things in the aftermath of passing this bill. Now, of course, I don't believe the government is in any way serious one way or another before, during or after in addressing those issues, because they wouldn't have introduced this bill in the first place if they were serious about it. But, you know, for the sake of form, let's rehearse the government's argument. The government's argument is like the argument that was made by the US military during the Vietnam War when they said we needed to bomb villages in order to save them. And what the government is saying is, in order to reduce rents, we have to increase rents. That's what they're saying. It is perverse Orwellian logic. We have to allow rents to be reset to even more unaffordable levels because somehow, by magic, that's going to make rents go down at some point in the future. Now, there is no evidence ever, anywhere, of that happening. This is market dogma of the absolute worst kind. But of course, the reason why the government aren't bothered that it makes no sense whatsoever is because actually the bill is going to do what the government really wants to do, which is further enrich the property speculators, the investors and the corporate landlords. And by the way, I want to say at the outset, I believe anybody who's a landlord in this Dáil should recuse themselves from this debate and should not vote on it. It's absolutely unconscionable that we're going to have a bill that is going to jack up already unaffordable rents to even more unaffordable levels, and that people who vote for that might actually benefit financially from it. It's outrageous, right? And we have, as we know, a disproportionate number of landlords in the government parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and some of the independents backing up this government. Disproportionate in terms of the political parties in this Dáil, and disproportionate in terms of the broader representation in society in this chamber. But of course, beyond that, beyond people who may actually financially benefit themselves, we have a government that believe in this nonsense that somehow property investors are going to solve the housing crisis. You know, I just kind of can't believe it, because the reason we have a housing crisis is because you handed over the entire housing sector after the crash of 2008, 2009 to property investors. That's why we have a housing crisis. I mean, I think of, in my area, Cherrywood, which is the biggest residential development. It's a good test case, do you know what I mean? It's the biggest residential development in the entire country and one of the biggest in Europe. So it's a pretty good sort of opportunity to look at housing policy and the biggest residential development. When that was taken over by NAMA, nationalised, brought into public ownership, at that point, we could have developed that to deliver social and affordable housing. Instead, Fine Gael-led governments decided, and Fianna Fáil subsequently, decided to hand it to property investors. And what is the consequence? Well, the consequence was for quite a few years they sat on it because it's more profitable to sit than to build houses. And by the way, we were actively asking that they should be built at that time, not objecting, asking they should be built, but they sat on it and waited for the value of those properties to go up, waited for the housing crisis to get worse, then they started to flip it to other property developers. As Mel Reynolds said to me at the time, he said, Hines probably had made a profit on Cherrywood before a single brick was laid, because they're making profit from speculating on building land. And then eventually they start to build the houses and apartments up there. What prices are they going for? The houses are going for 600,000 and 700,000 euro, unaffordable for the vast majority of people. The rents that are being charged, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000, 3,500 a month. Totally unaffordable for the vast majority of people. So who is going to end up owning it? Big property investment funds, big international pension funds and so on, charging these extortionate rents. And now the government wants to reset it even further. And as an aside, they don't want to build a town centre because you can't make as much profit out of town centres, which are needed by the community. But that's where this stuff leads. And you think these people are going to reduce rents because we now allow them to reset rents upwards. It's absolute nonsense. It's going to do increase profits, make rents even more unaffordable, further drive up, increase more speculation and do nothing. Well, worse than nothing. It's going to exacerbate the housing crisis. Just briefly, last couple of points. The bill is supposedly, all of this extraordinary action is supposed to be justified on the fact that there's going to be some greater protection for security for tenants because of the six-year rule. Right? Now, the problem with that is, if rents are unaffordable, and if you can still be evicted, which you can, for not being able to pay the rent, and the rents are unaffordable, then the likelihood of you not being able to pay an unaffordable rent, and therefore getting evicted for not being able to pay an unaffordable rent, is a lot higher. And if you're somebody who's looking for a new tenancy, and 60,000 to 70,000 tenancies end on a voluntary basis, or just end, so that means almost all tenancies a year, 60,000 to 70,000 a year, so almost all tenancies will end over a period of about a decade. That means all rents very, very quickly will be unaffordable. So anybody looking for a place, they will now, in Dublin it's currently 2,100 average rent. They will all go up to the level of what you see on daft.ie. You go on daft.ie, look for something now, 2,500, 3,000, 3,500. All rents will be up to that level. Dramatic increases, and that's going to happen all over the country, right? Exacerbating the housing crisis, driving more people into homelessness because there is literally nowhere to go for them that is affordable. That is what is going to happen. And, by the way, I just want to mention a couple of other consequences of all of this, is that people who are on HAP are going to get potentially a double hit on all of this, right? Because many of the people who are on HAP are paying top-up payments to the private landlord, and the HAP levels they're inadequate as they are, but they're not adjusted for rent increases. So if your landlord increases the rent and you're on HAP, the top-up you have to pay is even more. Now, huge numbers of people are in serious trouble because of the top-ups they're having to pay, because they're also paying a council rent, the sort of council-based rent. And council rents are now going up as well. So there's a change in Dublin, City, they're moving now to increase rents, in Dunleary right down, in different ways, in different places, but across the country, local authority rents are going up as well. So you're going to get a double hit for some of the most vulnerable people because of what you're doing, driving even more people into homelessness and crisis in crisis situations. And just on the sort of protection of tenancy thing, it will be possible under this, in fact it is now, but this is a loophole I guarantee you is going to be exploited by the landlords now for those where there is a little bit of nominally greater protection because of the 6-year thing, is if the house is not suitable to your need, if the residency is not suitable to your need. Do you know what that means? That means you can get evicted for being overcrowded. That's what it means. You have no kids and then you have a child, or you have another child, it's now not suitable to your needs because you need a bigger place. Landlord can say, sorry, I'm evicting you because there's more people in the house than there was when I signed the lease to put you in. And that will be allowed for under the legislation. So they will find ways to do that. Do these corporate landlords do that kind of thing? Oh, they absolutely do. I have the living proof across from me in a place called St Helens Court. I don't know how many times I've raised it, which is a multi-unit development across the road from my office in Dunleary. It is still 8 or 9 years later, the majority of the units, all perfect units, right? The majority of them are sitting there empty. Since it was taken over by a vulture fund, then another vulture fund, who tried to mass evict the tenants, eventually drove them out. We've successfully resisted some of the attempts to evict people, but eventually just they were, you know, the grind of being threatened constantly with eviction, having to go to the RTB, eventually people just leave. Some of them did get housed by the council, but the majority of those properties continue to sit there empty because it suits the vulture fund for them to be empty so that they can get beyond the existing legislation's restrictions on rent increases, so that eventually they can't jack up the rents again and get around the existing RPZs. So that's what they do. They play the long game. The landlords play the long game. They inflict misery on the tenants, try to evict people, eventually drive them out, sit on the properties, in this case for nearly a decade, perfectly empty when there's people out in the street, homeless outside, because it's profitable. Because it's profitable to do it. And the government allows that. It's absolutely shocking, and now it's going to facilitate even further that sort of profiteering. So, listen, there's a lot more to be said, and I'm sure my colleagues here will be saying many of those things, but this is a disgrace. And the best place for people who are worried about the housing crisis to be is out protesting. I hope we see more protests against this because the government have really revealed their true colours on this one, and we need to fight back. People who want something done about this housing crisis, to get affordable rents, to get secure and affordable housing, to protect tenants' rights, need to begin to get organised on the streets.
Thank you, Deputy Owen O'Brien.
Thank you, Cian Corla. And first of all, I'd like to speak in support of this group of amendments to 7 and 8, and I'll explain the detailed reasons why in a moment. I want to start, however, just by 2 small pieces of housekeeping. First of all, just to acknowledge the very helpful role of the departmental officials. They've obviously been working on this bill in a relatively short period of time, and at any stage when either our committee or ourselves sought additional information, they have been very obliging to make sure that we were facilitated in trying to understand the legislation. And I just want to make clear that the criticisms I'm going to make of this legislation are political criticisms directed at the Minister and the Government, and not on the hard-working officials who, in my opinion, are often put in very difficult positions producing complex legislation in short periods of time. I also want to say this is a truly appalling way to make legislation. And you can always tell when a government is embarrassed by its own proposals. You can always tell when a government is anxious that the public who are affected by their legislation get as little opportunity as possible to hear about those changes until it's too late, by government rushing through legislation in impossibly short periods of time. The bill before us is not simple. It is not straightforward, as we will discuss throughout the course of the evening, and it's going to profoundly impact the lives of tens of thousands of people. And yet we're being given an entirely inadequate committee stage opportunity. There effectively is no report and final stage, and the government is going to make the most substantial change to the regulation of the private rental sector in over a decade in the space of 10 hours, when you add last week, this week, and whatever time the Seanad gets next week. And the problem with that, of course, is not only is there a lack of scrutiny, a lack of media and public attention, but it also means that whatever the government's intentions, the negative consequences of the legislation are probably going to be even worse. And again, there's some specific instances in which I'll raise that. So I just want to put on record my strong objection, Minister, to how you've proceeded with this. And if this becomes the way in which you do your business, I think it's going to make the job of those of us in the Oireachtas Housing Committee who take our job as legislators much, much more difficult. Specifically, Ceann Comhairle, with respect to the amendments requiring the Minister to bring forward a number of reports, and there's a continuity between the three amendments because they're all reports related to affordability of rents now, but also affordability as a consequence of the changes you're making. I tabled a number of similar amendments, particularly to Amendment number 1 that Deputy Boyd Barrett referred to earlier, to try and delay the passage of the bill until such reports were produced. They have been ruled out of order, and I fully accept the decision of the Ceann Comhairle, but they're similar in intention to these. For me, one of the really shocking things when we dealt with the legislation of pre-legislative scrutiny is that when we inquired whether there had been any attempt by the Department to make an assessment of the impact of the provisions of this bill on the rents that renters pay, the answer was no. Now, that is an astounding omission on behalf of government, and here's the reason why. At the very centre of this bill, the most significant and controversial aspect of this bill is the market reset provision that will allow a landlord from the 1st of March of this year, when a new tenant moves in, to reset the market rent. If the previous tenant left voluntarily or as a result of breach of contract, that market reset will start at the beginning of that tenancy. And for all categories of tenant, it will be repeated every 6 years. So you would have thought, Ceann Comhairle, given the significance of that change, the Department might want to know the answer to two questions. How many people is that likely to impact in the first month, 6 months, 12 months, etc.? And the second question, you would have thought a minister who was interested in the impact of his legislation on renters would ask is how much extra are they going to pay? They're pretty reasonable questions which these amendments are putting to the Minister, albeit in retrospect, because that is all we can do. Thankfully, even though the Minister didn't think this was important information to have before bringing such radical proposals to Cabinet, the Residential Tenancies Board publishes the data that anybody with a little bit of time in a spreadsheet can understand. So I'd like to put on the record of the House the answers to those questions, which these amendments are seeking the Minister to provide, which the Minister should have assessed and provided for himself, his government colleagues and our committee prior to the passage of the legislation. But I think it's important that we hear it today. So question 1, how many tenants, how many people, how many households is the market reset likely to impact month on month from March? Thankfully, the Residential Tenancies Board over the last 2.5 years produced quarterly data looking at renewed tenancies and new tenancies. So we start to get a picture of quarter on quarter how many new first-time tenancies are created. And the data set is over 2.5 years, so it gives us a good kind of picture of what the trends are. And the straight answer is, on average, every quarter, 25% or more of registered tenancies are new first-time tenancies. That equates to, in the last 4 quarters, over 60,000 new tenancies. Some are single people, some are couples, some are families with children. So that means the potential, if those trends continue, the potential number of new first-time tenants impacted by the market reset is somewhere in the region of 60,000, if trends continue. That proposition is supported by the Residential Tenancies Board's other important piece of information, that the average length of a tenancy is about 3.5 years. So the first thing to say is that we're looking at, from March through till the end of this year into next year, tens upon tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of renters who the Minister and his Minister of State and my colleague, Deputy McGrath from the Housing Committee, are going to expose to the market reset. That's an indisputable fact. Sure, the changes may result in some changes in patterns and levels of churn, but it's likely they will be minimal. So that means huge numbers of people will be impacted by this month on month from March. So it leads us to the next question directly related to the 2 or the 3 amendments in front of us. What's that likely to cost? How much extra rent is Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Lowry and Healy Ray independents allowing landlords to charge from that market reset? And I appreciate this is going to be uncomfortable listening for some folks on the other side of the chamber, but it really is important that we have it on the record. In order to determine or try and work out what the likely cost is, we also have really helpful data from the Residential Tenancies Board every single quarter. Over the last 2.5 years, it tells us, on average, statewide, regionally, and in every county, including in the Count Corlas, including in the ministers, including in mine, what the rents being charged on average for existing renters are and what the new rents are. And that means, on a spreadsheet, you can just set out rents for existing renters, rents for new renters, look at the difference, and that will give you a pretty reasonable estimation of what the potential increased rent from the market reset will be. In fact, that data is from Q2 of last year, which means the scale of the uplift is likely to be much greater. So what's the answer to the question? Well, based on the RTB's overall data, anybody hit with the market reset from March, at a minimum, is likely to be paying 17% more rent than they would have otherwise. That is a very significant amount of money. That kind of averages to about €3,000 of additional rent in a year. So what you're asking us to vote for is for those people who start new tenancies from March of this year, at a minimum, to be paying €3,000 a year more. But when you actually start to look at the county breakdowns, this is where it starts to get really interesting, right? Because actually, the county by county and the city breakdowns are utterly staggering. Limerick, Minister, your own constituency. Limerick City is going to have one of the potentially highest market reset rates in the state, roughly €4,000. So what you're going to vote for tonight is that renters in your constituency, if they start a new tenancy from the beginning of March, they could face, over the next 12 months, €4,000 a year more than under the current regime on the basis of the RTB figures. And I appreciate, Minister, that might come as a surprise or a shock, but isn't it utterly bizarre that an opposition member using RTB figures has to stand on this side of the chamber 5 or 6 months after you propose this, and this may be the first time you're actually being told the actual impact on the people you claim to represent. Waterford City is in a similar region as well. Let's look at Wexford, Cancorla, because it's important we all know the impact of this, and I know you're neutral and you're not involved in this, but the uplift is 21% higher rent than they would otherwise be paying as a consequence of this bill. That's an extra €2,532 a year. I'm sure when you're out in your constituency, you will be told that's a huge sum of money for a young couple trying to rent to save for a home, or indeed for a modest income working person to pay. And what about Wicklow? Wicklow, €4,000. Right? Leitrim, €3,000. The single biggest uplift, the county that it has, or the city, should I say, that is going to expose renters to the greatest level of additional rent over 12 months is Galway City, €5,000. So before we have a conversation, and we'll have that conversation today about supply, before we have a conversation about tenure, because in both of those, the Minister's arguments are very questionable, the facts, as evidenced by the Residential Tenancies Board in their registration data and the rent data, is if this bill goes through tonight and into the Seanad tomorrow and passed next week, new renters in new tenancies will be facing potentially rent increases in the order of 20, 25, 30% more, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 in the case of Galway, 5,000 euros. And you've got to ask yourself, Minister, what have you got against renters? Do you really think renters have that kind of money to pay that extra? We know data from the ESRI is that renters, typically speaking, have lower incomes. Not exclusively, but typically speaking. So these are the people least able to pay the additional charges. We also know that students, the overwhelming majority of which don't live in the student-specific accommodation sector, they live in the private rental sector, typically speaking on 9-month leases, not 12 months, come September, are going to get hit substantially again and again. And that means, for example, families from the Western Seaboard, from Donegal, the Northwest, etc., who don't have significant university places close to them, are going to be hit by phenomenally greater rent increases. We'll talk about the mess you're making of the student-specific sector later. So the summary is as follows, and I've been saying this all week, right? And it's really interesting because nobody in government has responded to this. Nobody. Is that the summary consequence of this proposal, which these amendments is trying to get to the bottom of, is that somewhere in the region of 60,000 households, singles, couples, families, over the next 12 months will be asked by Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Lowry and Healy-Rae Independents to pay rent in the order of rent increases in the order of 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 euros. When you strip it all away, that's what is in front of us. And that's why I think these amendments are enormously important, because they're asking the Minister to do something he should have done and he should have published previously. And you might say, why are you so intent on imposing so much hardship on these renters? Well, you've given us the answer, and I'm sure you'll repeat it again today. You'll say the only way we can tackle the housing crisis is that we increase supply. And the primary approach to increasing supply from this government is to incentivise large institutional investors from the global markets to come to Ireland and build high-density apartment schemes, because as supply goes up, then over time rents will moderate. What utter rubbish. And the reason we know it's rubbish is because there is no analysis anywhere, either produced by your department or anyone else, that tells us that if you increase institutional investment to the high end of the market, high density, high price, that it will have any impact on price other than perpetually increasing rents. It's just economic absurdity. And yet the Minister repeats it over and over and over again as if it's some kind of empirical fact. If you really believe it, publish the evidence. Get a bunch of housing and economic experts to produce a report and put it on the table. Because in fact, the way you're designing this is not only will new tenant and economic experts to produce a report and put it on the table. Because in fact, the way you're designing this is not only will new tenants in existing rental stock be hit with market reset, in most cases at the start and at the end, but for new apartment stock, they won't even be constrained by the rent pressure zones in between. It will be CPI. It will be the most aggressive form of inflation possible. If I'm an institutional investor, thankfully I'm not, but if I were, you're guaranteeing me perpetually increasing rents irrespective of what happens for new and sitting tenants, something you're also, of course, permitting for new student-specific accommodation. So actually locked into your formula here is an incentive for those investors to continue to increase rents. And of course, as we know, because there continues to be an exit of small, semi-professional, accidental landlords from the market for a range of reasons, some of which is dissatisfaction from government policy, the lower end and lower priced private rental stock is going to continue to deplete. And the only new stock, if we get any significant increase at all, is high-end, high-density, high-cost. They're not going to be building anything in your constituency, Minister. They're not going to be building anything in Limerick. They might build something in the docklands of Cork, Deputy McGrath, but I don't think the hard-working constituencies that you well represent in our committee, talking about affordable homes, really think that €3,000 a month is affordable for a standard 70-metre square bed in the centre of Cork. I don't think anybody elected you or me to advocate for that, but that's what you're voting for here tonight. So this won't increase supply in the places it's needed. Where it does increase supply, it will be exceptionally expensive. And meanwhile, the lower cost rental, along with the under-provision of social, affordable and private for purchase homes, will dissipate. And then the final point I want to make on these amendments is every time I'm on a debate on these matters with somebody from the government, the last thing they want to talk about is the rents. God forbid we talk about the centrepiece of the legislation. Instead, what government keep talking about is, oh no, but we're giving people real security of tenure. We're giving people new, shiny 6-year tenancies where they can't be evicted. Now, first of all, under Part 4 of the Residential Tenancies Act, we already have 6-year tenancies. They used to be 4-year and they're now 6-year. They already exist. Right? Secondly, for existing tenants who remain in their current properties, as Deputy Ahern made the point during second stage, they get no benefit. For new tenants of small landlords, they can still be evicted during that 6-year period. Sure, there's a bit of a restriction, but there are still 3 very significant grounds upon which notice of termination can be provided. And for the large landlords, you're finally putting on the statute book what already exists in practice, which is institutional investors only evicting for breach of contract. The problem, of course, is, and again this relates directly back to these amendments, what value is security of tenure if you cannot afford the rent? And it was almost like the Minister has forgotten why rent pressure zones were introduced in the first place. I was never a supporter of rent pressure zones. I sat up there, argued tooth and nail that Simon Coveney was getting it wrong, tabled amendments that government wouldn't accept, and much of our criticisms of the RPZs, and many of us voted against them in the end, came true to pass. They did provide modest protection for some, but you couldn't have made a bigger hames of rent regulation than Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil did at the time. But the reason why rent pressure zones were introduced is because from 2014 to 2016, a new phenomenon had entered our housing system: child and family homelessness, something that back in 2011 was virtually unheard of. But because of rising rents and double-digit rising rents, the number of families and children entering into emergency accommodation for one reason and one reason only: an inability to pay a legally sanctioned rent increase from government, forced them into homelessness. Double-digit rental inflation. RPZs put some level of pause on that. What you are proposing here today is to go back to double-digit rental inflation. And Richard made the point earlier on, and the point has to be emphasised over and over again. Last year, about 20,000 eviction notices of termination were issued. Many of the people who got those notices are waiting incredibly long periods of time for social housing, and their rent is subsidised by HAP. Today, the gap between HAP and new rents is already too great for the vast majority of those people. You add another 3, 4 or 5,000 euros onto those new rents, it's game over. Why would you, Minister, a year into your job, when child and family homelessness is rising, introduce a policy that every single policy expert, frontline homeless service provider and anybody who can count is telling you it's going to increase and accelerate the rate at which families with children are going to be in homelessness? And you see, we'll all stand here month after month and we'll remind you that you guys took this decision. You took a decision to allow market rents to increase to double digits. As a consequence of that, people who desperately need private rental can't get it, and they are pushed into homelessness. And that means, and you'll accuse me when I do this at some later stage of personalising it, but that means you are directly responsible by the actions and the legislation that you are promoting, securing cabinet approval for, and getting the approval of your backbenchers. You are directly responsible for all of that. It'll push up rents. It won't increase supply in any significant level. Where it does result in increased supply, it will be expensive and inappropriate. It will lead to increased levels of homelessness. And you're introducing a security of tenure regime that is so complex, it is going to be very, very difficult to explain, even harder to understand, and virtually impossible to enforce. This is without doubt. And I've sat here and stood here for a decade, and I've seen some pretty shabby pieces of rent reform, shabby politically in terms of what government asked the officials to do. This is by far the worst in a decade, Minister, and this is what you're going to be remembered for. This is going to be the legacy that you leave. higher ever increasing rents, far greater financial pressure on renters, rising levels of homelessness, and a security of tenure regime, which I will put money on today. 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, we'll be back here. And whoever replaces you for the mess that you will have left will be trying to undo and unpick this. Just as we stood here with Simon Coveney in 2016 and pleaded with him, do it properly, do it right. Listen to the experts and those people who know better than all of us. He ignored us. Owen Murphy ignored us. Darragh O'Brien ignored us. And now you are ignoring us. And the consequence would be more housing failure. So these are eminently sensible amendments. I'm happy to support them. I'll be very interested to hear the Minister's response to what I've said. And we'll continue the debate. But this, without doubt, is going to be remembered as one of the worst interventions in the private rental market in recent history. And it will be the name Minister James Brown that will be associated with it.
Biddy Connor Sheehan.
Thank you very much, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, this bill is a mirage, because what you have here is you're talking on the one hand about security of tenure, and there are things in the bill in terms of security of tenure that I do welcome were they on their own in isolation. But we have a situation here whereby you have a policy outcome whereby you have drafted a bill that's so complicated and so convoluted, and you have made a policy decision that is essentially pulling in two separate directions. You're trying to offer, or you claim you're trying to offer renters improved security of tenure, but you're allowing landlords to reset the rent in between tenancies, which all but wipes that out. And I mean, I want to speak in particular in relation to Amendment 7 and Amendment 8, which are my amendments and which were grouped with this. And I also want to speak in support of Amendment 2. And at the start, I want to say that when we have all done it, myself and my colleagues here, in terms of what modelling or analysis you have done in relation to this bill, you come back constantly and you talk about the housing agency review into RPZs. That housing agency review into RPZs does not provide a predictable analysis as to what the effects of this bill will be, the effects that have been set out very well by the deputies that spoke before me. And the question I have is, I look at my own city of Limerick, who myself and the Minister of State both represent, and we have had the highest level of rent increases in the entire country. And when I look at the supply issues that we have, and I look at what you say about this bill apparently incentivising supply, the supply that this bill will incentivise, if it incentivises any supply, will be expensive, high-end, build-to-rent apartments. And those apartments do not get built in Limerick. And with the market reset mechanism, and with the fact of the average length of a tenancy being 3 to 3.5 years, and with the deficit that we have in terms of a lack of student-specific accommodation in Limerick, I'm really concerned that in respect of the city that I represent, that renters in Limerick are going to be on the hoof for at least 20% of an increase on their rent. And when I look back to 2016, and when I look back at the RTB amendment bill that Simon Coveney introduced, which introduced the RPZ regime and the 4%, and flawed and all as that mechanism is and was, at the very least when Minister Coveney introduced the legislation, that there was actually modelling done. There was modelling done targeted at areas with the highest and fastest and rising rents. And with this bill, you have not done anything to look at rent predictability. And not one witness who came before the Joint Oireachtas Housing Committee came in and said that this bill would result in rents not rising anymore or rents falling, and rents need to fall. They cannot rise anymore. Renters cannot pay anymore. And every witness who came in told us very clearly that this bill is going to open tenants around the country, tens of thousands of them, to absolutely extortionate rent increases. And as my colleague Deputy Boyd Barrett pointed out very well earlier on, there's a huge issue there in relation to HAP, because the HAP limits plus the homeless HAP and the discretionary HAP top-ups do not go anywhere near enough to what rents actually cost at the moment. And with this bill, you are going to have, a real return to economic evictions. People will be evicted because they cannot pay the rent. And when I look at this legislation, the truth behind this legislation is that this legislation is for large institutional investors and it's for big property developers. It's not for smaller SME builders. It's certainly not for renters, because government constantly talk about balance. But I find that term in relation to this bill frankly offensive, because the balance that is being struck against renters who cannot afford to pay what they are paying. And as true as night follows day, I look at the original RTB Act, which was introduced in 2014, has been amended 14 times. So that means if you look at it on average, every 18 months the RTB bill gets amended, as true as night follows day. And I guarantee you, either you or some other minister will be back, because rents will rise to a level which you politically and this government politically will not be able to sustain. And I have proposed Amendment 7, and the purpose of this amendment is to require the Minister and the Government to conduct a review into the operation and the effectiveness of all amendments made by this bill to the residential tenancies, and that review would include findings and conclusions, and it would be laid before the Oireachtas. Because you constantly talk about supply and the need to incentivise supply, but we have not had any clarity as to what this bill will actually do, bar the analysis when we have looked at it in terms of what it is going to do in terms of rent levels in this country. And there is no certainty that it will deliver anywhere near a level of supply to arrest the upward rising of rents. We know that rents in this country have gone up by the bones of, in Dublin, for example, by the bones of 100% in over a decade. And they're going to go up and up and up again. And I simply do not believe that this bill will work. You haven't laid the evidence before us as to how this bill will work. And I think you need to have a statutory duty to examine what actually you've done here, what the effects will be, and to actually come back. And Amendment 8 is similar to this amendment, and this is to insert a new Section 3, this time headed Impact Forecast. And this requires you, Minister, within no more than 6 months after this bill is passed, to publish a statement of the forecast of the impact of this bill on market rents for the next years. And the reason I believe that the government have not done any modelling like this is they know that fundamentally what we are saying in relation to rent levels in this country, what we have calculated from looking at the RTB data, is what actually will transpire, if not worse, certainly anyway in the short term. And in relation to this amendment, I'm looking for the forecasts to relate to a representative sample of tenancies. I think we, the general public, and most importantly, the tens of thousands of renters in this country who are terrified, who are literally terrified of the effects of this bill, so that they are entitled to know what the impact of these proposals will be. How much extra rent will they be forced to pay? And, Minister, if you cannot make such a forecast, then it is beyond irresponsible to push a bill through like this within the bones of not even 12 hours if you do not and cannot model what the bill is actually going to do, how it's going to affect rent levels over the next decade, how much renters are going to pay, and what the outcome of the bill will actually be in terms of this so-called supply, because we have asked questions like this, I'd say nearly half a dozen times since the general scheme of this bill came out, and I feel like constantly I'm getting the same answer. Because what we are going to see with this bill as well is we are going to see, for example, you have the new different categories of landlord. And the first thing I would say is Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael backbenchers are going to come in here tonight and they will not have a foggy notion as to what they are actually voting on, because this bill is so confusing, it's so convoluted. You're going to have, for example, you look at the restrictions that are there for larger landlords. Those restrictions should actually be applied universally, because the tenants of larger landlords are usually tenants of build-to-rent properties, of properties that are owned by institutional investors. First of all, the rent is already unbelievably expensive, but these properties are rarely, if ever, actually sold. And I mean, if you look in relation to the new so-called tenants of smaller landlords, not much effectively changes. And the fact of the matter is, people should not be condemned to rent increases of 20 and possibly 30%. We're going to have a situation now with the average length of a tenancy between 3 and 3.5 years, when it is ordinary working people on low incomes, are going to have to, in some cases, I reckon, between 40, 50, 60% of their hard-earned income is going to go on rents. This is going to absolutely crush them. And you have not set out at all, empirically, what, in effect, this bill is going to do to the to rents in the private rental sector. And there was more of this, as I said earlier, done when Simon Coveney introduced the bill at the end of 2016 in relation to the introduction of RPZs. Garmagat Ceann Comhairle.
Deputy Rory Hearn, followed by Deputy Paul Murphy.
Garmagat Ceann Comhairle. Minister, this is, as I've spoken about before, I think a bill that is going to be deeply, deeply damaging for renters in this country. And when we talk about renters, who are we talking about? We're talking about families, we're talking about individuals, we're talking about young people who are trying to work, trying to go to school, trying to go to college, just trying to live their lives. And what this does is rise rents in a way that will absolutely hammer people. And I will say it straight, I believe that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are utterly disconnected, and you, Minister, as well, are completely disconnected from what is the reality of trying to rent in this country right now. Because if you had any sense of what it's like to rent, or what it's like to try find somewhere to rent, you would not be doing this. The Taoiseach got up earlier today and he said, this is what we have to do in order to get supply. You said it yourself. This is what's needed to get supply. And at some point, the supply will increase to bring rents down. Now, I asked you this a number of times and you never answered it, and neither has the Taoiseach answered it. At what point will this policy incentivise a supply that is going to bring rents down? Is it going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? It's never. Rents are never going to come down, or else they're going to crash, and we're going to have an economic crash. That is the only point at which rents are coming back down again to any sort of sustainable level. Because with this policy, what you're doing is you are saying very clearly that we are willing to sacrifice, we being Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the independents, are willing to sacrifice these renters who are going to have to pay higher rents in the coming months, in the coming years, to incentivise a supply of housing that at some point is going to bring down rents. And my colleague, Ona Bryn, referred earlier to officials and saying, you know, in terms of officials, but I asked the officials in the Housing Committee, at what point does this bring down rents? And they used the word hope, that they will hope that this will bring down rents. This is a bill that is based on a flawed market theory of housing that completely fails to understand actually how housing markets and housing systems work. They don't work like normal market commodities, supply and demand, prices go up and down. People, and I actually was asked this earlier, you know, the market price isn't the market price what some renter is willing to pay. And if a landlord can get that market price, is that not reasonable? But you see, housing isn't a banana or a car. It's a fundamental human need. And so when a person is faced with having a home or not having a home, they will pay absolutely everything they can to get a home. So if you just allow the price, the rent, to be determined by the market, of course, the landlords will squeeze and squeeze and squeeze as much as they can get. And people are forced to pay more and more. They don't have a choice, like buying a car or buying a banana. They need a home. And so they spend everything they have to get that home. And that is why housing markets are regulated. That is why you actually have rent controls. It was the reason you brought in rent controls in the first instance, but now you're undoing that. And you have been bought once more and captured into that thinking that housing markets work like normal supply and demand, junior cert economics. This is not junior cert economics, Minister. This is people's lives. This is the lives of hundreds and thousands of renters and indeed hundreds of thousands of future renters. And again, I will come back to, and the Taoiseach gets up here and he says to the opposition, you have no monopoly on compassion. We're compassionate people too. Fianna Fáil was the party, and is the party, he says, of a social conscience. There's no social conscience in this decision. It is a cruel, crude, cold decision being made that you know and you've agreed will lead to higher rents. Who is going to pay those higher rents? Have you thought about that? Who's going to pay that? It's going to be families who are struggling at the moment to try and cover rents, who will go be evicted. And this is the other flaw that's within this bill. And you have said it very misleadingly, the Taoiseach has said it very misleadingly, that this bill is about increased security of tenure for renters. That is absolutely untrue. This is not about increased security of tenures for renters. It's not about increased security of tenure for renters. For all existing renters, they get no new security of tenure. And again, the Taoiseach got up here earlier and said, this will have no impact on existing renters, and that is the point. It provides no additional protections from no-fault evictions for existing renters. So we are going to continue to see the tsunami of evictions. Minister, I'm not sure how you feel that we have reached the highest levels of evictions since famine times in this country. That is what we're seeing. I don't know how you stand over that. And you stand over a bill that is going to make that worse, because not only are we going to have the ongoing pressure of evictions that are going on right now for all the reasons, mainly when landlords are selling up. Now landlords are going to be even more licking their lips at the thought that we can get market rents if we get this tenant out of here. We're no longer subject to the market, the intertenancy rent cap. And the really, really disappointing part of this bill is that it has been made it is a decision that's being made directly as a result of lobbying by institutional investors. And the lobbying record, as I've raised before, has made this very, very clear. Institutional Property Ireland represent all the big institutional funds, IRES REIT, Kennedy Wilson, Ardstone, and the list is here of the lobbying register. How many times Pat Farrell from Institutional Property Ireland has met with the government in relation to these policies, meeting after meeting after meeting, pushing for these changes. And they said it very clearly, Killian Woods writes about it. There's an article written last August in the Business Post, and it was written about IRES REIT. And it talks about how IRES REIT is so happy. IRES REIT, of course, is one of Ireland's biggest private landlords now, with over 3,500 properties. It says, from IRES REIT's perspective, the most eye-catching change is the new measure that allows landlords to reset rents to market rents between tenancies. Under the current measures, landlords are required to maintain rents at the same level between tenancies. And it describes how the representative of IRES REIT went on to show investors a chart where IRES REIT's average rents, their current rents, are estimated to be 19% below market rent. But under the new rent controls, and this is how it describes, there is a windfall sitting there for the company. It has the opportunity to unlock an additional 20 million euro a year in rent by raising rents to market rent. 20 million a year IRES is going to get a year from these measures. Kennedy Wilson will be similar. 20 million a year you're giving to them, you're going to give them as each churn happens and renters are required to pay the market rent. And so what this bill is nothing about security of tenure or renters or balancing rights of renters and landlords. It is a bill that is a windfall and is going to be a windfall for institutional investors in this country, the large corporate landlords. And that is what this is about. Because you've been bought hook, line and sinker into their idea that we allow rents rise higher, they will increase the supply, we'll jump up the unit numbers and we're dealing with the housing crisis. When it's completely the opposite. This bill will make the housing crisis substantially worse. It is a disastrous bill for renters and for young people who are stuck at home. It will put it more out of reach. It will put home ownership more out of reach. And it is incredible, really, when we think how far Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have come from being the parties supposedly of home ownership to now being the parties of the big institutional investors who are willingly making policy and laws to screw renters, screw the younger generation, so that the institutional investors can make more profits, more rents, and you're happy to stand over that. And as I said earlier, the disconnect from the human misery that this bill is going to impact, and that's what's really disturbed me about all the discussion about this, has been that disconnection. Because why it actually terrifies me, because what it says to me is that the government is not actually concerned about this mass of human misery, of a social catastrophe that's going on, because we're willing to inflict more. What we want to do, and what we are doing, is putting in place policies that doesn't solve the housing crisis, doesn't make housing more affordable, but simply keeps the market going. And that's ultimately, this is another subsidisation for the private market to add to the very significant subsidies that you're giving. I was putting the figures together there, and between the VAT cuts that you introduced in the budget, and the HAP payments that go to private landlords, you add in Croí Cónaithe subsidies, you're talking about over £1 billion a year going to the private market. £1 billion every year. Over the lifetime of your government, it's going to be £5 billion you're giving to the private market with no permanent housing in return. No public housing delivered, £5 billion. And you say you won't implement a state construction company, it'll take too long. We're not sure. A fraction of that amount would set up a public construction company to build actually genuinely affordable homes. You're not interested in solving the housing crisis. You just want to keep the market going. You want to keep the investors, the property developers, the banks, the system going as is. Because if actually you were interested in solving the housing crisis, you would realise that what you're doing with this is actually embedding a market and an unsustainable market. That's what you're doing, because these rents are completely unsustainable. When we look at, again, I was going back and looking at the rents that are being charged currently on Daft. You look around the country, thousands of euro every month people are expected to pay. We look in, for example, Cork. Examples of rents that people are being charged. In Cork, for a 4-bedroom, 4,800. In my own constituency, in Santry, €2,500 a month for a 2-bed. In Beaumont, 2,700 for a 2-bed. In Galway, €3,000 for a 3-bedroom home. These are the new units being built in Santry in Northwood. What are they charging? 1,900 for a studio, 2,600 for a 2-bed apartment, 3,300 for a 3-bed. And this is before your changes come in. And when you look at the income of a teacher, say a teacher on 44,000, after taxes, after the take-home pay, you're talking about in the region of that rent to pay 3,300, 117% of their entire take-home pay. A nurse on 37,000, let's say, you're talking about 127% of their entire take-home pay. A person on a minimum wage who gets a take-home pay of 1,900 a month, 168% of their take-home pay. It's impossible. It's impossible to pay these rents, and this is how you expect an economy, a society to function. Where are we going to get our nurses, our teachers, our bus drivers, our doctors from? And that is in our cities. They can't function and they won't be able to function, and they're not in many ways at the moment because of these policies. And deeply frustrating for many people around the country who are going to see their rents increased to market rent. It won't build one home for them. Whatever about in Dublin, it might incentivise a certain amount of really expensive apartments being built. It won't build one new home in Carrick-on-Shore. It won't build one new home in Kerry or Louth or Donegal or Mayo. And all the renters in those counties will face higher market rents because all landlords will be able to bring the rent up to market rent when a tenant moves out, and every 6 years in the new tenancies in those parts of the country. And they will not see one new unit from this measure, from these measures. Not one new unit will be built by an institutional investor who you're making these decisions for. Minister, it is a disastrous policy, and it just shows how disconnected Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are from the actual reality of this housing crisis. Unfortunately, it's not going to work. And it is the housing crisis, the housing disaster is going to continue. And what will you bring about? Higher rents for renters. And I think it's deeply, deeply disappointing and frustrating. And we'll continue to talk about this in terms of the disaster that you're going to make worse.
Thank you, Deputy. Next Deputy is Deputy Paul Murphy.
Thanks a lot, Chair. This bill should be called the Raise the Rent Bill. The purpose of the bill is to raise people's rents. That's literally it. You like to pretend that there's some greater, deeper meaning going on. You like to talk about security of tenure. But the purpose, the objective of this bill is to raise people's rents. People's rents have already about doubled in the past 10 years. But the government thinks that for the people they represent, the big landlords, so-called institutional investors, the rents aren't rising fast enough. So we're going to introduce this bill to raise the rents even faster, to cost the average renter more than €3,000 extra a year. That's the purpose of this bill, it's the objective of this bill, and it is going to be the consequence of this bill. You're going to ram this bill through, you're going to guillotine it tonight, you're going to shut down the debate in this House tonight, and the consequence is people's rents are going to rise. What does that look like? It's a massive further transfer of wealth from some of the poorest people in the country to some of the richest people and richest corporations in the country who are already making plenty of money from their very many rental properties. That's one impact. Another impact is that evictions are going to soar. And evictions are going to soar not from a low point, but from a high point. Evictions are already at the same level proportionately as they were in the 1850s in Ireland. 1850s in Ireland. Do you know what came after that amount of evictions in Ireland in the 1850s? What came after that was the land war, because people simply had enough. And I think that's going to come after now for the government as well. And people may ask the question, it just doesn't make any sense. They haven't presented any of the evidence to show what's going to happen, how this is magically going to translate into supply. All the experts are saying this isn't working. Should the government talks day in, day out about listening to the hard-working people, looking out for renters and so on? So why on earth are they bringing in a bill that is going to rapidly increase people's rents? And the answer is very simple. If it walks like a duck, if it swims like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, well then it is probably a duck. So it's a landlord's government. That's the bottom line truth of it. We have a government that is interested in representing the views and the material interests of big landlords. About a third of government TDs literally are landlords, but the rest of them represent them very effectively in any case, because ideologically they're committed to this idea that the market has to solve things. We have trickle-down economics, and then coincidentally all the policies that are supposedly great and are going to resolve the housing crisis that they've been doing for 10 years and have resulted in the housing crisis getting worse and worse and worse, but just a happy coincidence of all of that is that there's a big transfer of wealth from the public, from the state, from taxpayers' money to landlords, and from renters to landlords. That's the essence of it. We have a landlord's government that represents the interests of the tiny minority that are landlords, and even smaller minority that are big landlords in this country, as opposed to all of those who are affected by the housing crisis. The fundamental point is that the government represents those not who suffer from the housing crisis, but those who profit from the housing crisis. Why does the government keep introducing policies that make the housing crisis worse and worse and worse? Well, it's time to draw the conclusion that they don't care about ending the housing crisis. If the housing crisis ended, well then their friends, the developers, the big landlords, wouldn't be able to make the sort of money that they're currently able to make. That's the fundamental point. And that's why we need to get rid of this government as soon as we can, and it's why we need to be building a movement on the streets, in communities, to resist these rent increases, to resist the evictions that are going to flow from it, and to massively apply pressure on the government on these issues. I do want to raise a point about landlords in this, Dáil. I mean, I think it's shocking. It's shocking that about 20% of TDs in the Dáil are going to vote tonight on legislation that is personally going to benefit them. If you're a landlord and you vote in the Dáil tonight to pass this legislation, you're going to personally benefit, on average, to the tune of about €3,000. I think it's shocking that that is allowed in the first place, and secondly, that those TDs affected wouldn't put their hands up and say, look, maybe I personally agree with this, but I'm personally affected by this, I'm going to recuse myself from the vote. And even at this late stage, I would appeal on landlord TDs not to participate in this vote tonight. It's utterly wrong that landlords who personally benefit from the increasing of rents are going to get to vote on this, would personally benefit from it with such a devastating effect for so many people. I also would make the point, I mean, in general, we have a landlord's government with plenty of landlord TDs, but it's a bit much that literally the landlords lobbying organisation wrote amendments for TDs, and the TDs literally copied and pasted the landlord amendments and submitted them. This is the democratic process that Independent Ireland, Gillian O'Toole, literally got the same email that the rest of us got from the IPOA, the landlords lobby organisation, saying please put in these amendments on behalf of landlords, and Independent Ireland said yes sir, we represent the landlords, we submit the amendments. It's very, very blatant, and it shows you, don't let anyone fall for the idea of Independent Ireland representing the common man or woman. No such thing. They represent the landlords very, very explicitly. The landlord lobby says, we want these amendments. Independent Ireland says, yes, sure, we'll put them in immediately. And people should be aware of that. I want to raise a particular point about the impact of this in terms of HAP. The point has been made about the HAP levels. The other point in relation to that is, for very many HAP tenants across the country, effectively you have a double rent increase taking place. Councils across the country are hiking council rents. In many, Dublin City, for example, has voted to do it and is due to implement it from April. I know Galway has done it. I know other councils across the country. In South Dublin County Council, it looks like they're trying to go for significant increases to be voted on towards the end of this year to come into effect last year. This is a nationwide process. It's driven by council management, but it's also driven by the government. I mean, you read the government's latest housing plan, it explicitly talks about merging council rents and cost rental over time. In other words, doing away with the differential rent, doing away the basic fair idea that how much people pay for housing should be based on their income. And it's going to result in massive increases for council tenants. It's bad enough, but for HAP tenants are going to be doubly hit. Council HAP tenants are going to be faced with significant increases, let's say 30% increases in what they're paying to the council, and then they're going to be hit by this increase, which if the HAP limits don't increase, all of that will be gobbled up in the top-ups that they are paying. They're the worst affected, and they're some of the most vulnerable people in the housing market as a whole. And I would appeal, where the opposition is mostly united here, left opposition certainly in terms of opposing what the government is doing here, but I would call on all the left parties to take a stand on the councils against these council rent increases. And even if they have voted in some cases to allow these to go ahead, to reconsider that, particularly in light of what's happening here and the extra pressure that is going to apply in terms of HAP tenants. I'd finish just finally in relation to what our amendment is seeking to do, which is to, and it just shows you an image of how you could do things very fundamentally different. If you start from the point of view not of representing landlords, but instead of representing the majority of people who are affected by the housing crisis, you go about this a very, very different way, where you establish a board to reset rents to affordable levels, and where the guideline for establishing affordability will be rents that are in general no more than 20% of a tenant's income. That's the kind of alternative way of tackling the housing crisis, is saying let's stop pouring public money into the pockets of private landlords, of developers. Let's stop pouring and enabling more and more private renters' money to be funneled into the hands of landlords. Instead, let's protect tenants, let's ban economic evictions, let's control rents and use public money to have a state construction company to build social and affordable homes. It is like the sensible thing to do if you weren't governed by class interests of representing landlords and the free market ideology that goes alongside that.
Thank you, Deputy. Next Deputy is Deputy Thomas Gould.
I was listening to some of the other speakers and I'm thinking back on the comments you made at the Housing Committee and in here in the Chamber, and I just don't get it. You're intelligent people, We know we've seen the crisis, the housing crisis, go from a crisis to an emergency. We know that homelessness is off the charts, and that's only homelessness that's being recorded for people who are living in emergency accommodation, not about people who live in 3 or 4 generations in the same home, not the hidden homeless, the true figure that's there. So, like ministers, when you sit down and you look at the homeless figures, the housing crisis, house prices going up, rents going up, evictions going up, homeless going up, do you really, in your heart of hearts, believe that this bill is going to solve that? Because I don't believe you could. If you were the intelligent men I believe you to be. I think you're so desperate. I think, Ministers, you've come in now and you've inherited an unbelievable housing emergency. And you're so desperate now to find solutions. And here come the investors, the big investment companies, the big speculators, the vulture funds, and they produce to you, this document will deliver housing. Can I tell you now, Ministers, it won't. And the only way to solve the crisis is supply through, is by building social, affordable housing. When you think of all the people who are living in Hap and Ross properties in the private rental market, so if you deliver social and affordable housing and take them out, that frees up all the rental accommodation then for the renters who badly need it. And Minister, I was talking to a couple of people over the weekend, and they said to me that this is so cruel. The consequences, for them, it might be the 1st of March, but it will be in the future. And they're terrified because their rents are too high already. Their rents are through the roof. They're struggling to hang on. I was talking to a girl now, college educated. She is a child, she's renting. She can just about afford it. What happens when she can't? Can you answer me that question, Minister? What happens when her rent resets to the market value and she cannot afford it? This is a person though with a good job, a good education, doing everything right. What happens? Where's the support? Because this lady won't qualify for HAP. She won't qualify for Ross. As you know what she told me? Nearly all her friends are in the same position, that they're renting because they cannot get mortgages because the price of housing is so high. And the reason the price of housing is so high is because you didn't build houses for years, you left the market, you have a fascination about the market will solve it. No, Fine Gael came up with this solution after the financial crash, and Fianna Fáil should have learned from the financial crash that the one thing we cannot rely on is the market to sort out problems like housing, like health. Any of the major problems must be sorted out by government. And like, rents are not just unaffordable, they're crippling families. They're stopping people. And Minister, a consequence of this now, some people won't be able to move for 6 years. Because if they move, they know they'll not be paying the new market rent of wherever they go. I'm talking to people who are living together, even though their relationships have broken up because they have nowhere to go. I've been contacted by women who are in abusive relationships, either physical or mental. Where do they go with their kids? Where do they go? I've helped families now in Cork to access emergency accommodation, and then in a couple of weeks they're being asked to go out because there's no capacity for them. And like, there are consequences. Like, the one thing I heard up here is when I became a TD, they said, Thomas, you must always be aware of the unintended consequences. There are so many negative consequences to this legislation that either you're not considering or you're not, you don't get. And so what we will see now, and this is not me saying this, we had a housing committee, you were in there yourselves, we were all in there, and all the experts told us rents will increase, evictions will increase, homelessness will increase, but you know what will also increase? Profit. Profit by these big investment funds, vulture funds, speculators, because they look at Ireland now and they see a place that they can make profit. And it goes back to greed is good. Your job is to protect the people. Your job is to ensure that people have a safe place to live and to raise their families. And like, the amendments we're talking about now call for a review and call for a report. Like, the one thing I've learned since I come up here is you follow the science, you follow the data. The figures don't lie. And what the figures have said here is that this bill will have a catastrophic effect on rents and drive them through the roof that are already too high. I spoke with a lady. She's on disability. She's in a half property. And the only way she can keep the roof over her head is because every month her retired father gives her money because her rent is so high, the HAP isn't enough. She's on disability, and only for her dad she'd be homeless. And the thing about it, I have another family in the same position. I was talking to a man, and he explained to me that if it wasn't for his brothers helping him out with the rent, because he had lost his home, because where they were living was being sold, and they had to move into, they had no choice. They just had to get whatever accommodation. And the cost of that accommodation is so high, they can't afford it. And he's being supported by his family. What happens when it goes up? What happens when the consequences of this bill drives rents higher? Ministers, there's so much more I could say, but I think a lot of my colleagues have touched on it. Listen, we all make mistakes in life, right? Dear, for the grace of God, go any of us. I think you've made a mistake. The 6-year security of tenure would be a positive step if it didn't allow the market rents to drive so many people out. And like, there are people watching this tonight, and they realise the consequences of what will happen when this bill is finally passed. But you know, the worry I have is the people out there tonight who don't know what the government are doing, and will only realise in weeks, months or years to come the consequences of this. People will be left terrified. They will be left without hope. The government can't sort out all the problems, but you know what you can do, ministers? You can give people hope. This bill will not give people hope. It will give profits to the rich and the super rich, and it will drive ordinary working people into the hands. Like, there are money lenders out there now. What happens when people go to money lenders and they can't pay the money back? Where do they go? What happens when they borrow from family and friends and that runs out? Where do they go? Lads, it's a mistake. You're following the lobbyists, and I think it's time to step back. We'll work with you. I give you that and I leave you with this. We will work with you to bring forward a bill that will deliver housing, that will deliver rents that are affordable, that will make a change for people. I think we can all commit to that, but not to this bill.
The next deputy is Deputy Paul Gogarty.
I did want to get onto the Housing Committee, but I'm not a member of it. But I do welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill again and to support the amendments that were tabled, which relate to reviews, reports and caps. And I suppose if you're asking, and I've already said this, I support the bill in principle, the concept of it. But what's been proposed here raises so many questions, so many concerns, as others have mentioned, that it's hugely unlikely to do what it's intending to do, unless the intention is purely to increase the supply and increase the profits of large developers and increase the profits of the real estate investment trusts that are largely from outside the country. For example, I see the logic of the exemptions for new builds that's linked solely to the consumer price index to try and get more construction going. I totally get the concept that the state needs to get other people building and get more supply into the market, and eventually that supply will hopefully stabilise or bring down prices. But there is a huge question over the market reset as it's proposed here. There could have been a happy medium where there was some form of an increase, but it was a capped increase, and it wasn't totally a so-called market increase, because as others have said, housing should never be just left to the markets. It's about people's daily lives. And you know, it's got to the stage. I have a constituent, for example, who has fallen back in arrears because it took them a long time to get their HAP, and they're now asking, can the local authority give them homeless HAP, because the landlord has indicated yes, they'll take the homeless HAP if the council pays it, if you can't pay it. And the council is saying, well, that's an existing tenancy. So you have a situation where the person, once they're evicted, they will get the homeless HAP, but they're now going to have to end up paying a much higher rent, and the state's going to have to pay a much higher rent. Like, look, the HAP figure for this year, I think, is something like over 570 million. Now, obviously, if you just took that 570 million and tried to put it into building houses, you'd get 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 houses. You're not going to get the amount of houses that are needed. So, if you were trying to develop a system, you wouldn't have brought in HAP in the first place. But we're kind of stuck with it now, and that's the problem. So what's going to happen is, as the rents rise and people can't afford to pay them, the taxpayer is essentially funding the bill. And it would have made a lot more sense. We've had various suggestions about housing, that the state should become the single biggest developer. And successive governments have argued against that, saying that's not feasible, it might breach the Growth and Stability Pact, etc., etc. But we need to look at the actual cost of housing delivery. Like, we haven't really had a serious discussion about a state real estate investment trust where people, through the credit union or something else, would contribute towards the purchase or the construction of housing, and they would be stakeholders, but it would be a social enterprise. So there may be a return on the investment, but it would be a lot less than the massive super profits that these companies are going to make, and it would lead to a situation where you could have affordable rents going forward. Because if you leave it up to the private market will take its toll. And I'm digressing slightly here, but the same principle applies. In Lucan, South Dublin County Council, in their wisdom, didn't have their, I suppose, social enterprise company tender for the operation of the swimming pool. Instead, it was let out to a company called Aura Leisure, who are very successful and very competent in their own field, but there was no underlying subsidy. So now you have a public pool where people are paying commercial prices because it was left up to a commercial operator to manage it. So in every situation where you bring in the cut, whether it's the developer's cut, whether it's the investor's cut, they're going to take a lot more than the government or the local authority would take in terms of the common good. The investors' cut, they're going to take a lot more than the government or the local authority would take in terms of the common good. So I think I want to also reference what other people have said in terms of the risk of properties being the incentive to end tenancies sooner than would otherwise have been the case. I think it was Deputy Boyd Barrett mentioned the situation in relation to an extra family member. Yeah. So basically, there's no absolute clarity on whether or not a house will be deemed unsuitable because you have an extra child, or it could be a boy and a girl, and all of a sudden it's overcrowding. Tick a box, and here's our excuse. Now we'll get them out, and we look at what ways we can increase our income. Those type of kind of unknowns are very worrying. But the one I mentioned in my second stage contribution was just basically the mindset of, let's try and find a way. I have a family member, we'll try and get them into the house, for a couple of months, and that's covering a family need. And I also raised the issue, which wasn't answered, which was the enforcement. How do you know that the properties are meeting the family need criteria? How many extra people are going to be employed to investigate it, for example? Because I've already mentioned the Residential Tenancies Board is massively underfunded, and I have a situation where it's 18 months since I put in a case about a very dodgy landlord who has multiple properties, is in breach of multiple planning regulations, and isn't registered with the Tenancies Board, and there's been no comeback. And I'm sure that situation is multiplied throughout my constituency and throughout everyone else's constituency as well. So we don't have those checks and balances. We have what you could call, in one sense, an attempt by the government to do something visionary and be seen to tackle the crisis. So you set your new market rate and then you have your 2% cap going forward. It looks very good in principle. The problem is with, for example, the smaller landlords. I think a person who owns one property, and there may be a lot of TDs with that, but I know there's TDs with multiple properties. It's a business. But if someone, from talking to people, because I've been dealing with a lot of these types of landlords, the smaller landlord is the one who wants someone to mind the property for them. They treat their second property often as their own because they've inherited it. Or it's an investment, so when they're in retirement age, they have a kind of a steady income. They might let a company manage it and they get a percentage of it. They would prefer to have a lower rent, but with very steady tenants, because as well as the nightmare, greedy, obnoxious, unrelenting landlords, you also have a minority of tenants who are nightmare tenants. So the small landlord wants an easy life, and they're the type of people we should be encouraging to stay in the market, not the massive investors who are treating it as an income stream. They might be more efficient in terms of managing multiple property units, but they're going to keep pushing the prices up, and it is about affordability. So as these smaller landlords are selling up, the tenants who, unfortunately, a lot of the homeless hubs are full, they're overcrowded. So when a tenant eventually does find a new place, the rents have gone up massively, and they may not be able to afford to pay those rents. And if they are, it's with the assistance of a local authority who in the years to come will have had to get increased HAP thresholds and payments, which is going to come from basically taxpayers' money and state money to keep the system going. So all that money is coming from one source, but it's going to the developers, and it's going to the big investor funds, the institutional landlords. They're the ones siphoning our collective money away. So that's why we need to look at housing as a social enterprise rather than a for-profit enterprise. And while this bill does make an attempt to do a noble thing, and I'm not getting into the attacks on the government that you've no compassion, or that everyone's in the pockets of investors, although historically Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael have received a lot of largesse from developers. I do believe that's through the legislation that's been brought in, at least, that's died down. But we do still have cosy relations between politicians and developers on an individual level. And we have to think about having a cosier relationship with our constituents, the people who are suffering through increased prices, the people who are suffering through increased rents. We have to think about their common goods and everyone's well-being. And that's why I support the amendments. I do support the concept of this bill, but we do need to look at it more from the individual living in the house and the family living in the house, rather than the people making the profit out of it.
Next deputy is Deputy Brian Stanley.
I want to support amendments 2, 7 and 8 in relation to reviews and reports. The reality is, though, is that ministers and the two of you know what's going to happen here, because we can see it already. We can see it from the minute that you announced this back into the autumn of last year. You can see what's happening. Notices to quit are increasing, rents are increasing, and pressure on tenants to move out are increasing, because landlords know and I'm not nailing all of them, putting all of them into one box, but a lot of landlords, particularly the bigger ones, know that come the 1st of March, the sky is the limit. And this evening you're planning to ram through this legislation, and I'd ask the two of you, you know, that we're TDs, but we're human beings as well. I'd ask you to think about this. Just think about the people who are in private rented accommodation, and I know some of them, and you'll know them, who are paying 50%, 55% of their wages and total income on rent. That means there's not enough money for food, not enough money for clothes, not enough money to heat the place, not enough money for their kids, and a whole range of other things. And that's just the basics to get through life. Just think about them for a minute. I'd ask you to do that. And there's 3 Laois TDs will have a vote on this. One Fianna Fáil, one Fine Gael, independent, yours truly. Right? And I wish all 3 of us were voting together on it. I dearly wish that. And, you know, while the 6-year tenancy thing, the certainty around tenancy, that is a good thing. I get that, right? But the problem is what you're bringing in on the back of it. It's a Trojan horse. You know, it's going to have huge implications. My amendment, and I hope we get to it, is around trying to limit it to 2% or the rate of inflation, the CPI. So who is the rate of inflation not good enough for? Who is 2% not good enough for? Who is lobbying for this? Is the Irish Property Owners Association getting everything they want? Everything, right? Is the developers getting everything? Because they've got everything they want. They got the VAT cuts, they got the tax breaks, they got everything else that they wanted. You know, and I want to see more housing. But the point is here, is that what you're doing is a charter for misery and further misery. And you know it, I know it, because I meet these people. You know, ordinary working people, couples, lone parents, ordinary workers trying to get by, and pensioners. And this is one coming down the line that people sitting here in 10 years' time are going to have to deal with, a tsunami of pensioners who are in private rented accommodation. And the state will wind up supplementing that if we don't do better in terms of cost rental, and if we don't do something about trying to slow down rents. The RPSEs weren't perfect. The RPSEd had some cooling effects. But despite the RPSEs, rents in Laois, according to daft.ie and other surveys, show that rents on new tenancies over the last 2 years have increased to 15 to 16% over existing tenancies. That's what they are over it, 15, 16%. If that's happening at a time when we have RPSEs, what in the name of the Lord God Almighty is going to happen when you remove all of this and you can say the market rent? The market rent is the highest in an area. It is the highest in the district. You know how it's going to work. And this talk about there won't be no-fault evictions. There's going to be evictions. There's going to be notices to quit. For the simple reason is that, and I pointed this out numerous times, is that the rents will be so high that people will not be able to afford it. And those landlords who are inclined to have a rack renting attitude, you know, they are now facing into the 1st of March with this gift in their hand, and that will be used, to make no mistake about it. Not saying every landlord, but the rack renting ones will, and the bigger ones will. Tenants going into new apartments and housing will face extortion increases. And also, the tenancies don't last 6 years. We know there can be a quick turnover. In the case of, and I know you have a 3-year provision in relation to students, but I have a granddaughter going to college. She commutes 5 hours a day. She wouldn't have a hope of being able to stay near the college. She can't. You know, or her pals, they can't. Simple reason is that rents are already that high. What's going to happen when this comes through in terms of in the private sector? And I would say to you, Laois renters will be very, very hard hit, because when I see the increases already, where you have rent pressure zones and some cooling effects, the fact that new tenancies already are 15, 16 and almost 17% higher over the last 2 years. A one-bedroom apartment across the road from my office was on the market for $1,750 a month. A very small house in Kilminchy was $2,100 a month. And Foxborough, a 4-bedroom house, not a huge house, was $2,500 a month. can't afford it. You know, look at the average wages, take-home pay. Some of these people are paying for creches, they're paying for commuting, they have to make payments on 2 cars, they're trying to save for deposits, they're trying to do a whole range of things. And they're literally strapped, nailed in trying to carry out all of this. And the race will be, and for those landlords who are unscrupulous, the race will be to get to the top, you know. And I support the idea of the forecast, the reviews and the reports, but that in itself will not be enough. That's why I put in the amendment to limit it, to try and cool it to 2%. I recognise there is inflation. I'm trying to be somewhat reasonable about this, but this will be all impediments to skyrocketing rents will be removed. And existing tenants in homes and apartments are being put under huge pressure and will be put under pressure for higher rents, because this measure will provide the climate for that to happen. And there will be strategic notices to quit, as I said, because people will not be able to afford it. And I would appeal, they're not here unfortunately, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael TDs, not to vote this through. This will hurt tens of thousands of tenants who are already struggling to keep their head above water and who already are dealing with difficulties. And we must, and I know, I've never come in here and said there's a magic wand. I know this is a complex thing to sort, but I do know as well there's a number of things need to happen, you know, and within the gift of the state, one of the things is to be able to increase the supply of cost rental housing for those people who are middle-aged, who can never be able to get a loan again, who maybe have come out of a broken marriage or whatever else. They need to be able to get into a cost rental. We need to try and help those people. A not-for-profit option that will pay for itself over time. You know how it works. I remember talking about it here 12, 13 years ago when people didn't even know what we were talking about, the need for cost rental. I welcome the fact that government are moving on that, but we need to move quicker on it. We need more of them, and I'm saying that to you. The mass production of houses is a drum that I've banged loud in this chamber. And I welcome the fact, I said it to John Cummins yesterday morning, for the first time it has arrived with council engineers and architects, that we'll be able to mass produce. Mass production means speeding up, it means also reducing costs. And while there's been a lot of talk from the officials in the department about standardised design, etc., you know, the fact that now that it's gone that step further, that you have standard, very real standard plans. In other words, that houses internally can be the very same, and you can change the texture outside if you like, if a county council wants to do that. But that will enable matters to be speeded up a bit and will remove a lot of the blockages. And anything else, and I'm saying this to you sincerely, the two of you, with the two ministers here, that anything else you can do to accelerate that. You know, we don't want to drop standards. I'm not arguing for that. But anything we can do to accelerate the delivery, anything we can do to reduce the costs, because there's money there, you know, and we know it's taxpayers' money and we have to use it well. Anything we can do to reduce that cost, I certainly will support that and increase the supply. And I do recognise not all of it will be provided by the state. I know that. Right? I'm not going to argue for that. Right? I know that. But the state is a big player here. And because of the fact that the Progressive Democrats and Fianna Fáil, you know, since the late 90s decided that, you know, we'll just opt out of the social housing stuff. That's why we have the mess we have. That's why we had the crash, because of the regulations were taken off. And we had the regulations off buildings, off construction, regulations off the banks. And we wound up in the situation that we're in. And it's a difficult situation. I argued as well over the years here, going back over the last 15 years, to increase the number of apprentices. And we must do that. We must do that because we can't build houses unless we have the people. And let's try and attract more of the workers back from abroad who went during that period and who might wish to come back now. We do need to increase the labour supply and ensure that we have sufficient workers to do it. I would like to say as well that people want to save for a deposit, but you can't save for a deposit paying those rents. These rents are not affordable. They're not affordable at the moment. And I would say that to you, you know, they're not affordable for young people. They're not affordable for that cohort I'm talking about that are middle-aged and elderly. You know, a couple recently I came across, they were almost 80. The local authority housed them. Laois County Council, and I don't mean this in a plow-mossing way, but they have really stretched themselves to try and do their best. And I know you're down on Friday, and I welcome the fact that you're there on Friday. It's always good to see ministers in the constituency. And the one message that I'd be saying to you is come down, see what's been done. We want more of it, and try and replicate that in other parts of the country. So I'd ask you not to force this through. The Irish Property Owners Association they're getting what they want here. The developers are getting what they wanted, but tenants they're already suffering hardship and stress and misery. Workers, students, lone parents, ordinary people, let's think about those, and let's not force through this bill here tonight. This needs to be rolled back on. We cannot heap more pressure and stress on those people.
Deputy Collins.
Indeed, Chairperson. And I suppose Deputy Stanley said the words, don't force through this bill tonight, and maybe I'll echo that sentiments to Minister for many reasons, and I'm agreeing with the amendments that are here before us tonight. And let's be honest, I do hear quite a lot here comments about landlords. And, landlords are made up of, unfortunately, some people have just one extra house, and they're classified as a landlord, which I think is very unfair to be called a landlord. And at the same time, I deal with landlords quite a lot. I have to deal with them. If you are a person coming to looking for a house, you're not carrying out your duty correctly if you aren't going to speak to everybody that's concerned. That's the council, the landlord, everybody. And most people, the landlords that I speak to, are decent, honest to God people, and we tend to have a real habit here of attacking them, as if they're all bad people. So where are we going to get the houses from? That's what just scratch the back of my head when I hear too much criticism of landlords as to where do they think houses are going to come from. They don't just build they don't come up through the field like a mushroom, in nice mild weather. They actually have to be built, and they cost a lot of money, and people put a lot of time and effort into their resources into it. And then anyone that does need to make a genuine profit. But they are difficult circumstances, and I just, I mentioned the word, I heard the word unintentional consequences, and one size don't fit all, and unfortunately this bill needs a hell of a lot of fine-tuning. There's elements of it that you could agree with, but there's more elements that are going to cause problems, and I can see that too. The bill is locking thousands, we'll say, of tenancies permanently below a market rent. That might sound good on paper, but in the real world it drives landlords out. The 4% reset over 4 years is modest, predictable and fair. It gives tenants certainty and landlords a reason to stay if rents can never move. Properties leave the market and tenants lose homes. This amendment is about keeping supply, not enriching anybody. So the bill draws a hard line at 3 tenancies with no explanation. That's completely out of step with the existing law. The Turtlestown amendments use 10 units, not 3. Many ordinary landlords in towns and villages exceed 3 units. Unintentionally raising the threshold restores consistency and fairness. Small landlords are not the enemy. They're the backbone of the rental sector. And people must keep that in mind. I'm not a landlord myself. I just have one house, thanks be to God, and that's enough for anyone. That's for me, sorry. So, I see I've been accused online to be on Airbnb already. I don't know where people get this cracked up information, but look, it keeps them happy tapping away their fingers. But I just have only my own home that I live there. So property rights don't disappear because someone rents out a home. If a landlord needs a home for a close family member, that should be respected. Grandchildren, siblings, nieces and nephews matter too. The bill also fails families dealing with bereavement. If a landlord dies, their family should be allowed to sell the property. These amendments are about basic fairness and compassion. That's in here. This bill introduces a new criminal offence, including jail time, not for exploitation, but for getting complex rent rules wrong. That is completely disproportionate and will scare decent landlords out of the market regulation. Regulation should be firm, but it also must be fair. Criminalising people is not heavy. Criminalising people is not a way forward. And also, as I said, unintentional consequences. And I've been very vocal about this over the last few weeks in relation to the short-term lets, and it is in here, the short-term lets as well. And this is going to have devastating consequences for short-term lets, Airbnb in small rural communities, because the 20,000 came in yesterday, which is very, very much to be welcomed. But the bottom line is people still require planning. So I'd say most of the 98, 99% of them are running for the last 20, 30 years. They didn't have planning. They didn't need planning. They were quite happy running their business. Everything was running above board. They had fire safety. They had all that checked, insurance, everything. But planning is a different game. And I was at the meeting today inside with the committee, and they're all over the place. They're all over the place, the planning authority are, and the tourism board are. They don't know what they're doing here. And I need, Minister, you need to intervene here in this matter. You need to, anyone that was, I have no problem with regulation. Nobody that I've met, I had a public meeting last Friday, and I have another one again tomorrow night in Clonakilty on this issue. Packed rooms, packed. People concerned they're going to lose their income, an honest income they have. And this bill has unintended consequences that will happen. It will force them in. You could look at our amendment, which is a waiver for people that were in business, and any new Airbnbs will have to be fully compliant. That's quite acceptable. Registration is not an issue with them. Communities don't have hotels, so they depend on Airbnbs to bring tourists into the community. So this bill has positive points. I think it's been rushed through here, not just rushed here tonight, but rushed in general. I think it needs to be re-looked at. I think this is one area, short-term list is a very, very serious area, as I said, we welcomed the change yesterday of the 20,000, but I still think that there needs to be more changes here because if people require full planning, and they will, they could be compliant, they must. There's two boxes: have you planning or don't you not? So if you're 30 years in operation of property, and I know some people do. My mother was doing Airbnb in the 1970s, believe it or not. So I know it down in Skull because everybody loves to visit rural areas. No, she's not. Obviously, she passed on. But the point is, how many more people are doing that? A survival, farmers, little bit of a side income, mainly female. Mainly female. People can try and work at home and do this business, and now they're faced with the dreadful consequences of having to apply for planning permission, which will devastate their business. So I would like, if you re-look at that area again, I just plead with every Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael TD here, and independent, not to vote for this until this confusion has been resolved. I don't think you're going to listen to me, but I got to push from my angle to the best of my ability. The clock is ticking on this new legislation, and we desperately need changes. Airbnb is hugely important to the people in the short term. That's hugely important to the people out there, and they're contacting each and every one of us, and there are thousands throughout the country. So again, I think it's unintentional consequences, and it needs changing. But my worry is if we push through this legislation tonight, the planning legislation is there and it's in place and it has to be acted on to the next, for the Minister Peter Burke to work on, and that is going to be landing his desk next week, I'm told. And you could see, if this is to go the way it's going, Airbnb, as we know it, ending in rural communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Collins. With no other members indicating at this time, so the question is that the amendment be made. Is that agreed? Apologies.
Thank you very much. Cahirlock, as we know, we live in a housing crisis, and that is a supply crisis. We have a rental crisis, which is a supply crisis, and we have a homelessness crisis, which is a supply crisis. And what we are endeavouring to do here is strengthen tenants' rights, which we are doing, which is security of tenure, which means tenants will know how long they can stay in a property while driving investment. And investment, Deputy Hearn, is not a dirty word. We need private investment. We need private investment. I know, but you stand up here and you're constantly attacking anything to do with investment. You seem to believe that by banning the word around landlord or investment, it's enough mud to keep throwing.
It's not mud, it's the reality.
Nobody in this House has a monopoly on empathy. We are trying to solve what is a housing crisis driven by a supply crisis. So it is. And what have we heard from the opposition here? Have we heard a single solution? Your only proposal is Deputy Boyd Barrett referred to misery. You want to freeze the housing crisis into a permanent misery. That's what you're looking to do.
You want evidence.
So it is. What you want to do is keep the current situation in perpetuity. What I need to do to solve the housing crisis, it's not simply about protecting existing renters. It is about all those people at home who need somewhere to live. And that means driving the supply of homes in this country, such as driving social homes. We've delivered more social homes in 2024 than in any year since the 1970s. We've delivered record affordable homes, and last year we delivered over 36,000 new homes, the highest since 2011. And we have to drive the supply, and that needs investment. The government is investing the largest amount of money in the history of the state into housing delivery. 1 in 3 euros of the new National Development Plan of capital funding is going into delivering housing. That is record funding. But the state can't deliver every housing solution. We need a very significant amount of private investment. And what we're doing is, we also have to protect renters. And for the first time in the history of the state, we're introducing security of tenure. And that's what you're going to vote against. So you are. Introduction of security of tenure. For the renters who currently, I'll answer that question, for those who are currently in a rental situation, their position doesn't change. 240,000.
Yeah, they're still as vulnerable to no-fault evictions.
But look, on the one hand, you wanted to stay the same. On the other hand, you want change.
No, I said very clearly. We say clearly a no-fault ban on evictions.
In a single sentence earlier, Deputy Hearn said that the landlords are licking the lips and they're also getting out. You know what I mean? At least when Deputy O'Brien makes a hypocritical statement, he sandwiches it to try and hide it a little bit. You just actually, in a single sentence, like, it makes no sense.
Absolutely. It's not a hypocritical statement. It's reality.
It's just word spaghetti in the hope that something lands, or when you leave the chamber, you've got 20 seconds for your social media. What we have to do is provide housing solutions.
It's about people who are going to suffer these rents. You're not doing this as 20 seconds for 20 seconds for social media. That's disgraceful.
Have to drive the supply of homes.
Thank you.
If we're going to solve this housing crisis in this country, and that's what we're doing here, while also providing, as I say, for the first time in history, security of tenure. So we are, and that is the crucial part we're doing here. You know, you don't have to like everything in the legislation, but you're going to vote against security of tenure. That's what you're going to do. For the first time, people will have the confidence of knowing. In the case of large landlords, effectively, they can stay there forever. They know they will be able to do it. There are certain exceptions for smaller landlords, but they still know they will have at least 6 years. And we know that in terms of homelessness, what's the greatest driver of homelessness? Notice the quits. But we're going to give security of tenure, so people can put in roots, so people can feel safe and know what their personal situation is. So I think it's quite cynical, actually, the opposition here. You're united in cynicism against this legislation. We cannot do nothing. If you actually do what the opposition want to do, which is freeze rents and have an eviction ban, it actually doesn't even retain the status quo. It's actually just going to get worse because our population is increasing by between about 70 to 90,000 people a year. So if you don't increase supply at all, if you freeze the situation as the opposition want to do, that's the situation. And we're delivering record affordable housing. We're delivering the largest most social housing in 2024 since the 1970s, and we'll have the 2025 social housing numbers quite soon as well, and that's what we're doing here. We want to solve the housing crisis. That's what we're working towards doing. And as I say, look, I get what the opposition are doing. It's playing on the fears and the emotions of those people who are in a rental situation. We don't have that luxury, because I think it's actually quite cynical to do it. What we are doing is making the tough, difficult decisions to drive the supply of the homes that we need, and we've heard nothing from the opposition about how you would actually drive the supply of homes in this country, so we haven't. A number of comments there were made. Look, Deputy Stanley, why are your rents going up in Laois? Again, because it's for lack of supply. The only way people in Laois are going to get homes to live in is by increasing the supply of homes. You know, it's absolutely crucial, so it is. And, right across the country. As I say, record social housing being delivered as well since the 1970s as well. So the status quo only makes things worse. Why are we doing this? This is actually not being done in a hurry. Like, we announced what we were doing here today last summer, so we did. It's gone through a pre-legislative scrutiny. There's been loads of times to analyse this. We're in here for a 5-hour debate here tonight alone. There's ample amount of time for anybody to have assessed this and make a consideration as to when we do.
Thanks, Deputy. You have a
But
chance
one
to come
thing
back
we
in,
are guaranteed, Deputy, the rents are not going to come down. Rents are not going to come down if you continue with your policies.
I don't have policies. You're the government.
We know it.
I'm not.
We know it. That's exactly what
I don't have the policies to implement them. But when are the rents going to come down?
We won't have back and forth, Minister.
All you have, Deputy, are slogans.
Deputies, let the Minister finish and you'll have a chance to come back in when the Minister finishes. Minister, if you can direct your comments through the Chair, Minister, that would be great.
A Freudian slip from the Deputy there. So it is. So look, we're driving on. So we are. We are addressing the housing crisis in this. We are wanting to solve it so we can get people into the homes they need. And that's why we're driving on with social homes. It's why we're driving on with affordable homes. It's why we're driving on with private homes as well. And why we're bringing in stronger protections for our tenants in this country. In relation to the actual amendments proposed here, you know, it is actually every piece of legislation under the Standing Order 204 provides that 12 months following the enactment of a bill, save in the case of a finance bill and the appropriation bill, the member of the government or minister of state who is officially responsible for implementation of the Act shall provide a report which shall review the functioning of the Act and which shall be laid in the Parliamentary Library. So there's an automatic review of all of this, always happens. Anyway, we have a board, which is the RTB board, which we have increased the resources by 70% this year alone, who will back and support and ensure that our tenants do get their rights protected. We've already seen last year the CSO figures show a 38.7% increase in apartments in 2025 compared to 2024. Our policies are working. We're going to drive supply, and that's how you solve the housing crisis. It's how you solve the rental crisis. It's how you solve the homeless crisis. And simply putting the crisis that's out there into a perma-freeze will not solve it. And peddling misery is not going to solve this housing crisis either. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy O'Brien.
Sometimes it's what the Minister doesn't say is the most revealing than what he does say. I made the statement at the start of my contribution that on the basis of data from the Residential Tenancies Board in the first 12 months of the enactment of this bill, anything in the region of 60,000 households will be impacted by the market reset. The Minister hasn't challenged that. Just like in any of the radio debates or TV debates I've had, nobody's challenged it. So what that means, Minister, is you are clearly accepting the RTB's data that over the next 12 months, at least 60,000 households, single people, families and children, will be impacted by your decision. The other interesting thing that you didn't respond to is the analysis of the Residential Tenancies Board data actually detailing the increase in rent for those households in the coming months. Average of an extra €3,000 a month. In the Minister's own constituency, it's a little bit lower, €2,500 in the year. In Cork, for example, since the Minister of State has joined us, what you're voting for this evening, based on the data from the Residential Tenancies Board, and I know it might be difficult to actually hear the real-world financial consequences of what you're voting for, but in Cork, the extra rent that you're going to be imposing on new renters in new tenancies from the 1st of March in a year is €3,100 across the city and county, but in the city specifically, almost €4,000. And I asked the Minister a very simple question: how is increasing rents on renters in every single county in the state going to contribute to increasing the kind of supply that people need in every county in the state? So in Cork County, Minister of State, you seriously suggesting that incentivising private institutional investors with record rents is going to lead to the delivery of apartments to meet the needs of your constituents? Of course it's not. And you...
Thanks, Minister. Thank you, Minister Aldridge.
You know, Minister, that the only investors who are interested in this kind of rents are investors that might deliver, you weren't here earlier, so I'll repeat it for your benefit, who might invest in the Docklands of Cork and in very, very high-end, high-cost parts of Dublin. So you're going to ask constituents in your constituency, Minister O'Sullivan, Minister O'Brien, or Minister Brown, apologies, to pay somewhere in the region of an extra €3,000 a year for new tenancies. You had an opportunity, Minister, to dispute the RTB data, and you chose not to. And if you want to dispute it, I'm more than interested to hear your analysis. But you're going to be asking new renters in your constituencies to be paying an additional rent of in the region of €3,000 a year for no extra supply in your constituencies, because the institutional investors, the very particular category of institutional investors that Minister Brown is talking about, aren't coming to County Cork or aren't coming to County Wexford any time soon. And just to rebut the Minister's assertion. So first of all, we're here dealing with your legislation. Want to have a debate about our solutions? Fine, we'll do it any day you like, and I'll deal with some of them now. But this committee stage is about your legislation, the impact that your legislation is going to have on real people in real time in the months ahead. And you keep saying that this rent hike bill, coupled with the reduction in apartment design standards and the massive tax break for apartment builders, is going to lead in a dramatic increase in supply. I have to say, I have heard nobody in industry say that. It will increase some level of supply in some parts of Dublin and Cork, but nowhere else. And the cost of that supply is going to be so expensive that the working people that many of us represent won't be able to afford it. So, yes, we need to increase supply. Yes, we need to increase social supply. And I have to say, I do find the line that the government keep trotting out about more social homes than any time since the 1970s. 1970s, we had half the population. Our social housing waiting lists were a fraction of what they are today. So actually, if you wanted to make an honest assessment between now and the 1970s, we're delivering less than half what was delivered then per capita, and even fewer in proportion to need, despite the fact that this state has more money than ever before and a capacity to deliver. You also accused us of protecting existing renters. Like 20,000 existing renters get notice of termination every year. They're then going to have to find other rental accommodation. As a consequence of that, they're going to have to pay these additional rents. It simply makes no sense. And to claim you're introducing security of tenure for the first time is just one of those things where Darragh O'Brien came in here in 2023 and said he was introducing tenancies of indefinite duration. Yeah. He was misleading this House. They weren't. Likewise, you were not for the first time introducing security of tenure. The Residential Tenancies Act in 2004 had an element of security of tenure, but there were so many loopholes, that many tenants were left behind by it. Darragh O'Brien's tenancies of indefinite duration had so many loopholes, it was the same. And likewise, let's just look at your proposals here to respond to your comments. New tenants in properties of small landlords can still be evicted if the landlord or a spouse needs the property. They can still be evicted on the grounds of financial hardship, ill defined as it is, on the need to discharge a debt. But here's the really important one that you didn't mention. They can be evicted if they can't afford the rent. That remains. So if somebody enters into a tenancy at new market rent and then is hit with 2% or CPI each year, whichever is the lowest, and at any point in that 5 years or 6 years they fall into rent arrears, they'll be evicted. And Mr. Sullivan, maybe you're smirking at that remark. Maybe you weren't here in this House when in 2014, 15 and 16, huge numbers of families were evicted from their homes because they could not afford double-digit rent increases. That was a reality. That's what drove family homelessness right across this state in 2014, 2015 and 2016. Now, if you think that's funny, if you think that's something to smirk about, that's okay. But what you are proposing and what you are going to vote for
scenarios
is
that
going...
don't exist. What are you talking about? You're trying to say I'm smirking or laughing at that?
We're smirking. I'm quite happy to engage. If this was a proper committee stage, we'd be able to have those engagements. That's one of the things we've been denied. So let's be very clear. Double-digit rental inflation leaves renters unable to pay their rent. They get into rent arrears. They get a notice of termination for non-payment of rent, and they get evicted. That's what happens. What are you proposing for County Carlow for new renters? Potential rent increases in the first year of 29%. Cavan, 29%. Clare, 26.9%. Cork, including the county, 25%. The city, 20%. And on and on. Not a single county, not a single city for the market reset will have a rent increase in the first year of less than 17 or 18%. Some go as high as 35%. That's what you're proposing. And even if Minister Brown was right, even if this was at some point lead to an increase in supply, let's imagine that thesis was correct. Who makes you think it's acceptable for renters to have to pay the extortionate cost of those rents for that supply? It beggars belief that you can come in here and not be at least honest and say, in order to attract the very specific kind of institutional investment you believe is necessary, and I'll come to the alternative on private sector investment in a moment, we're going to have ever greater rip-off rents from rents that people today can simply not afford. The Minister also likes to say that people on this side of the House have nothing to say about private sector investment. In fact, I'd probably spend more time talking about alternative and better forms of private sector investment than the Minister does. The missing piece of our private sector housing crisis is not high-end, high-density, high-cost private rental. That's not our problem. The missing part of our crisis, Minister, is a failure of government to support and activate the small and medium-sized builder-developer sector to build significantly more good quality private homes at more moderated prices in every county in the state. And how you deal with that is you fix the problems facing that sector, something that is entirely absent. And you also repeated a line that the Taoiseach has repeated, that the 240,000 tenancies currently in place aren't impacted. And you see, what that completely ignores, and again it goes back to the Residential Tenancies Board data that I quoted at the start that you have ignored, is every quarter for the last 2.5 years, 25% of all registered tenancies are new first-time tenancies. The state of the private rental sector is a constant churn for a whole variety of reasons. So if those trends continue, within 4 years, almost all tenants in the private rental sector will be captured by the market reset, some not paying it ultimately until year 6. But that's what you are proposing. And the Minister also said the greatest driver of homelessness is the crisis in the private rental sector. In fact, that's not strictly true. The greatest driver of homelessness is the failure of the state over the last number of decades, including under this government, to deliver a volume of social homes to meet the needs of people who need social housing. That forces people into the private rental sector for extended periods of time, and then when they become homeless, they remain in emergency accommodation far too long, again because of your failure to provide adequate social housing. So there are plenty of solutions on this side of the House, but what the Minister ignored, what the Minister tacitly accepted, is tens of thousands of renters in new tenancies from the start of March are going to be hit with rent increases in the order annually of €3,000 to €5,000. That is the data, Minister, from the Residential Tenancies Board. And I would love you, in fact I would give you an hour of my speaking time if you would set out your analysis that allows you to shake your head. Because what your officials told us is they weren't asked to produce any analysis to underpin this bill. The Housing Agency weren't asked to produce any analysis to underpin this bill. None of the academic experts in our universities who specialise in the private rental sector were asked to do any analysis. So, unless you have an analysis that you have been hiding from us all, then either the RTB data is correct and you must accept it and you must live by it, or you have to produce something else. And, Minister, we're going to go through other aspects of the bill as we go. But I would have thought at least you would have been honest enough to say, yeah, the primary purpose of this bill is to allow rents to rise. We've made a calculated assessment. In order to attract a certain category of institutional investment, they want rental yields even greater than what the new private rental sector stock is getting now. And we've said that is no problem. Off you go. My final point is this. The Minister is right. There was an increase in apartment completions last year. Almost all of those have been bought by the state. Virtually no new private sector investment acquired any of those. And therefore, the idea that somehow at the end of last year's completion figures, including apartments, in any way is a justification for this, I have to say, is simply unbelievable. Final point is this. I'm going to make a wager, Minister. 6 months, let's come back and have a debate on the impact of this bill. 12 months, if you're still in office, that is. Come back in here and let's have a debate. Schedule it. Give government time. I invite you to come back in here and prove that we were wrong and that you were right. Because if you have the courage of your convictions, and if you actually had a credible analysis of your bill, which you don't, you would agree to that without doubt. Of course, we can't even get you into a television studio to debate us on any of these matters. So I doubt you'll be willing to give the time, because as the month-on-month and the quarter-on-quarter figures come in, we are going to see the consequences of your policy. And how do we know? Because we have been here before. Richard is the longest-serving TD dealing with housing here in the opposition. I'm not far behind him. Simon Coveney made all the same promises. All the same promises.
I can name a few ministers before.
Homelessness rised, house prices rised, rents rised, and the wrong kind of supply never materialised. Owen Murphy made all the same promises, folks. It's almost like Groundhog Day. And what happened? Homelessness rised, rents rised, house prices rised, and the wrong kind of supply, or the right kind of supply, never materialised. And your own party colleague, Darragh O'Brien, probably made more promises than anybody else. Darragh gets it done, as Oliver Callan used to crack in his sketches. And what happened? Christopher, tell us, what happened while Darragh was minister? No, I'll tell you what happened. Homelessness rise. I know it's funny. I know you think it's hilarious. Real people, as a consequence of the policies of your party, ended up in emergency accommodation who should never have ended up there. That's the consequences of what you guys do, and you're doing it again. And you're doing it in a far more serious manner than you've done in a decade. And that's why I don't think any of us on this side of the House make any apologies for highlighting the real-world impacts on real people of your legislation and your votes. And you can try and distract all you want about social media clips, as if nobody on the government benches uses social media. You seem to be getting a little bit better at it yourself, Minister, but social media clips don't hide rising homelessness numbers. They don't hide rising rents. They don't hide rising homelessness figures. And they don't hide a government that continues to miss almost all of its targets. And I look forward to debating the social and affordable housing output figures for 2025 when they're eventually released, because I suspect those targets will have been missed as well. This is a really terrible piece of legislation. It's going to have profoundly negative impacts for tens of thousands of people. And I have to say, the fact that you can't even acknowledge that or respond to the factual information we've put in here today shows that, contrary to my very generous colleague's assertion here, you haven't made any mistake at all. You're doing this deliberately. You're doing this knowingly. And while you might be hiding from the evidence, you are doing this because you have chosen to do it in full knowledge of the consequences, in full knowledge of the cost, and shame on you both for doing so.
Dr. Sheehan. Well, you're down third now. I'm not.
Gormagat, Cahirlock. Minister, in your response to the amendment, you didn't actually meaningfully address the amendment, because when you spoke about Standing Order 197, like these reports, and this all came in as part of political reform in 2011, like they're often delayed. So in some cases, they've been delayed in respect of pieces of legislation for 2, 3, 4 years. God knows where we'll be. And there's no actual proper, thorough, standardised approach for how these reports are done. I know, and I was flicking through it there, that the Library and Research Service in 2017 did a very good analysis piece on these reports, and they found that the reports have been done in a very ad hoc way, and that no committee has actually undertaken a review of any enacted legislation on foot of a post-enactment report. And the reason I have placed this amendment here tonight is because we know that this bill is going to push rents up. The fact that you haven't challenged that assertion in any of your responses is telling. And I think that it will become too politically difficult for this government to sustain a situation where rents are allowed to be reset to market rate and to increase by anything up to 15%. And we will be back here again. If we're not back here next year, we'll be back here certainly before the local elections. And where will we be at then? Will we have people paying €3,000 a month? I mean, if you look on Daft at the moment, and you look at Dublin, for example, even just around the corner from where we're speaking here tonight, two-bedroom apartment, more than €3,000. And what's going to happen with this bill is that if you get any new supply at all, it will be largely build-to-rent units. It will be units that most ordinary working people are not able to afford, and it certainly won't be any supply in Limerick, where I represent, because investors, large institutional investors, will not get a return on, they will not get enough of a yield to build, expensive build-to-rent apartments in Limerick. We don't have any demand for them. And you talk about record investment, but the outcomes for this record investment are by and large incredibly poor. I'm always astonished when I hear the government talking about, in particular, affordable housing, given that about 35% of what is counted as affordable housing actually comes from vacant property refurbishment grants. And Minister, you have not addressed the simple question I asked. What is the effect? What is the forecasted impact of this bill on rents in the private rental market for the rest of 2026, for 2027 and 2028? And the fact that you're pushing this legislation through without being able to answer those questions is frightening, because you're talking about supply, and I agree with you in relation to the need for increased supply. I also agree with you in relation to the need for private sector investment, but this is not going to certainly deliver anywhere near the level of private sector investment to build housing, particularly in areas outside of Dublin and outside of very niche parts of Cork. And the fact of the matter is that when the completion targets come out, for every year since 2021, the government have been approximately 2,000 units or more under target. And you're not going to reach your target again this year. So you're talking about the crisis that's there in the rental market, the crisis that's there with homelessness. And I always think of the key recommendation of the Housing Commission that social and affordable housing should make up 20% of all housing stock, when at present it makes up around 10% of housing stock. And the fact that you won't and that you cannot even meet the targets that you have set yourself since Housing for All came in 2021 really highlights to me that you're looking in the wrong places for a solution to this. And I do not think that this bill will improve the situation. It certainly will not arrest rising rents. It will certainly not arrest rising homelessness. And you should lay before us a report setting out exactly the modelling for this bill, because we have all gone through the RTB figures, we have all done the calculations, and the evidence as it has been laid out by myself and other speakers before me is absolutely frightening, and it is going to devastate renters who are the most vulnerable people in the housing system at the moment.